following segment is presented in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. I told you guys one of my top priorities heading into the legislative session is, there are so many, but is to try to get lawmakers to actually take action on emergency power reform. We saw for several years during the pandemic that in Washington state, there are no checks and balances, virtually no checks and balances on the governor in a state in a time of emergency. And I think that's wrong. I think that directly elected representatives in the House and Senate are closer to the people. They represent the interests of constituents across the state as opposed to representing the interests of just the city of Seattle. And I really thought that they should demand to have a say in what was happening with the closure of businesses and the mandates and restrictions that were put down. And it was really disappointing to me that Democrats just didn't want anything to do with it. Well, this session, as I mentioned on a previous show, there is now a bipartisan proposal that has been put forth to try once again to work toward reasonable emergency power reform. It was put forth by Republican State Senator Linda Wilson and has been co-sponsored by Democratic State Senator Mark Mullet. I spoke to both of them about what it would do. I know you guys have both supported in the past putting some checks and balances on a governor in a time of emergency. So how did we get to Senate Bill 5063 and both of your names being on it? Senator Wilson, we'll start with you.
Well, a few years ago, I started running the bill 5039, which was, I think the first time, well, it was 2 years ago. And I think after the emergency started and the governor called the state of emergency, that's when I realized that there was more that we needed to do, that legislature needed to be part of the decisions. And so started looking at the bill from the year before, which was a bipartisan bill. Senator Hunt had signed on to it, and it was tweaking the law because it had been years and years since that law had been looked at. And then we needed to figure out a way to involve the legislature with the others because it was the shutdowns of the businesses, declaring who's essential, shutting down the schools, things like that. So that's what prompted the bill.
Senator Mullet, emergency power reform is a far less popular position for folks in your party to take. So how do you find yourself on this bill? Why is it something you're willing to sign on to?
I think I've signed on with Senator Wilson the past few sessions because I say to my colleagues, you have to look at this of what's the right form of government, not who currently has the governor's seat, but pretend it was the opposite party who had the governor's seat. What set of rules would you want in place? And I think if everyone's being intellectually honest with themselves, they would all support this bill because if the shoe was on the other foot, we would want this bill in place. And so I don't see how my message to my colleagues is we should respect how our Republican folks would want the same, and we would want the same. And this bill is actually the right public policy for the state of Washington. The governor can enact an emergency. It can't go on forever without involving the legislature at a much greater extent.
So let's talk about really one of the two big things that this does in terms of giving the legislature a little bit of oversight. Because when I look at it, it not only seems very reasonable to me, but it still seems like a high bar. You know, it's not making it very easy for one party to come in and to undo what the governor has done. So Senator Wilson, can we start with you? Can you talk about, we'll split this up between the two of you. Can you talk about one of the big changes that this bill would put into place when it comes to emergency oversight?
What it would do is after 90 days from the original call of the emergency power or state of emergency, then we would have the ability to come in and as a legislature and either extend it or terminate it, right? And with our bill, you would have to if we're out of session, all four corners would then have to vote to extend the emergency. If and that we didn't have that. We don't have that at all right now, particularly when it comes to statutory orders.
And just to be clear, the element that allows if the legislature is not in session, a state of emergency has already been in place for more than 90 days, and you say the four corners can come in and they can, in writing, terminate it. That means the minority leader and majority leader in the House and the Senate.
That's correct.
So there has to be, in order for that to happen, there would have to be unanimous bipartisan agreement amongst the leaders in the House and the Senate.
To extend it, right. It would take four corners to extend the emergency.
Senator Mullet, the other element where if the legislature is in session, they would have to, via concurrent resolution, decide what to do with the state of emergency. Can you explain what a concurrent resolution is?
Well, you basically just would have to have approval from both bodies. This is the course of action they want to take. And so you're forcing people to take a vote on whether or not this is what they want to see happen. It just would guarantee that we're kind of being held accountable to the people we represent. Because each legislative district, if you say that's roughly 160 or 70,000 people, we're much closer to the people we represent than a statewide elected official who is representing 7.6 million Washington residents. And I think the idea is hold people accountable down to the lowest ladder rung you can.
Mm-hmm.
With that concurrent resolution, though, so this is section B, if the legislature is in session through passage of a concurrent resolution terminating the state of emergency, is that a simple majority? Is that more than a simple majority?
I think it's a simple majority, Senator Wilson, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you, Senator Mullet, to weigh in on, I kind of want to pick up where the legislature left off last year. There were some Democrats who had some maybe tight races they were facing in November of 2022 who expressed interest in the 2022 legislative session in emergency power reform. Senator Emily Randall was one of them. She ended up winning her seat again, but she pushed a bill, much to the disappointment of the governor, when it came to emergency power reform. Do you believe that that was a genuine effort to actually make change, or do you believe that was an election year stunt?
Well, there's definitely members in the Senate Democratic Caucus who wanted to see the reform. I thought that bill, I mean, I use the term butter soft. I thought it was not a very hard, aggressive bill. No. And I will admit, I was shocked when that bill passed the Senate and went to the House, the efforts the governor's office went through to make sure that bill didn't pass the House, because it just wasn't that aggressive of a bill. As you read it, it would have been hard, I think, with that bill, because I think we needed 3 out of 4 in that bill, Linda. But once again, that bill, it took an active effort to end the emergency. It wasn't like it took an active effort to keep it going. Right. And I think that's Senator Wilson's bill says you can keep it going, but it's going to take some energy. Whereas the bill the Senate passed last year that the governor's office was obviously very uncomfortable with, because they put a lot of political effort into making sure it didn't get out of the House, was basically it just made it a little bit easier for us to end the emergency, but it still took a lot of political effort on our side to do that. And so it didn't pass the House, but there were folks on my side, I know, I'm not going to out them here right now, but who wanted to see reform as well. And so maybe the prime sponsor of the bill might have been picked for strategic reasons. I think you bring up a valid point there, but there was, I can assure you, a group of Senate Democrats who also wanted to see the same reform that our Republican colleagues were asking for.
I love how you say you don't want to out them, like it would be some terrible thing for them politically for people to find out that they support emergency power reform.
Hey, the governor vetoed one of my bills that passed like 49-0 last session. And so I think when I say that, it just, obviously you're priding yourself to have some very non-controversial bills vetoed by the governor when you come out publicly in some of these situations.
Senator Wilson, do you have a different opinion of that? Do you believe that, given the fact that that it's not an election year like it was, this session isn't going to land in an election year like this past one, do you think that that is going to dampen enthusiasm from some Democrats to pursue this?
I would hope that they would see the light. I mean, as Marcus said, there are others that would appreciate moving forward on this bill. And there may be tweaks in it, but that's how they're made. And I hope that there would be the political will to do this year. Like you say, it's not an election year, and you have to look at the long term, right? It was 1969 when the original emergency powers were put in, and nothing had been done since until 2019. So it's time to look at this. We have different abilities to do things like, zooming to vote and all that. Now we don't have to, ride horse and buggy to get up to the Olympia. So I think that we need to catch up.
Yeah. In terms of priorities, though, Senator Mullet, every session brings new priorities, and I've been looking at some of the pre-filed bills, et cetera. This session, do you think for Democrats that they're willing to make this a priority? You don't have to out anyone, but have you heard any sort of momentum that this might be a priority?
I think it is going to be a tough political lift, is my guess. And I signed on to the bill because I think it's the right piece of public policy that we should have in place for the state of Washington. But I agree with your assessment that it was more likely to, I think, get to the finish line last session, just given the politics of a tough election year coming up, and people realizing this is where I think the general population of the state of Washington wants to see. So I think this is a bill that I think is popular with the voters overall, but I also think this session will be a very hard political lift to make this a priority that gets to the finish line.
And I'm just curious to have you weigh in. I'm not trying to get you in trouble with your party or anything, but something really pissed me off last year at the end of the session. Like you said, this emergency power reform passed the Senate, it goes to the House, and then all of a sudden at the last minute, it doesn't move. And some Democrats in the House blamed Republicans, saying, well, they wanted to come to the floor and speak about this, and it was wasting time, and we didn't have the time, so they just killed it. Do you think it was fair to blame Republicans for killing it at the last minute?
I don't think it's fair. I was obviously in the minority in the Senate my first 5 years there, from my 2012 election through the 2017 cycle. And when we were in the minority, that's the tactic you do in the minority, is you tend to slow down floor debate, because a lot of times the chamber, the group that's in charge of the chamber is passing legislation that you might not like. And so it's a very traditional minority tactic to try to slow down the speed of what bills are going through that you don't like, because the theory is if you spend more time on one bill, that could be 5 other bills you don't like that don't come up for a vote. So I think that's a very traditional practice that both sides of the aisle have used. So I don't think it's very fair to say, oh, what you're doing is now we're going to punish you for it, sort of thing.
Yeah. Senator Wilson, let's end with this, and it'll be the same question for both of you. Even if you want to speak more broadly about the upcoming legislative session, what are your hopes for it?
Well, I at the very least, I hope we get a hearing, right? We didn't even get a hearing for the last 2 years. And so not only did it not get a vote, but it didn't get a hearing. So I would like to have the conversation, right? An honest and open conversation about the plus and minuses of doing this. And that's what we can do in committee. And I'm not in that committee, but certainly I'd like to get in there and express what my concerns are and represent those that elected me, right? Because that's what's been lost in this whole thing, is that the legislature is the voice of the people, and we haven't had the opportunity to be their voice in so many things. I mean, there was like a couple of years ago, or I should say later in the emergency, there was like 500 proclamations, and so many of them we had no voice. So that's what I'm hoping for, at least.
Senator Mullet, similar question for you. And then I guess, how would you message this to your party when you're trying to maybe convince them that, hey, we need to take a serious look at this year?
Well, I think my main message is the one I mentioned earlier, that you have to pretend the shoe is on the other foot. What do you think is the right public policy for the state of Washington? And that would be, it's the same message I've had before. And I think last year, the argument was, well, the Randall bill is moving, and so that's the bill they heard, and that's the bill that was going through the legislative process. I'm not aware of any Democrat-sponsored bills this session, so I think Senator Wilson's bill that I've signed on to is the one that can force this conversation to happen, and hopefully it does.
And I gotta say, it just disappoints me to hear, Mark Mullet might be one of the most honest politicians in Olympia, because he just says what he thinks is true, even if it bothers his own political party. But it just bums me out to hear him say that he thinks it'll be a heavy political lift to get emergency power reform, to get his party on board with emergency power reform this session. And it's just silly to me, because any of you, I just challenge you to go and read the bill. It's not even that long. It is so common sense. It would require bipartisan agreement to undo anything that a governor has done when it comes to a state of emergency. And for that reason, it's like I said, it's so reasonable, it's so common sense. And I think it would show a lot of good faith on the part of Democrats if they try to get something done on emergency power reform this session. And I really hope they can make that happen. The previous segment was brought to you in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org.